Well, it's fall now. The larch are changing color in Montana, so that means it's time to do reviews of the new gear I got this year. Hey guys, I'm Dan from ShastaBubba Adventures, and number one on the list of new gear I can't wait to tell you about is the X-Mid 2 from Durston Gear. I've been using this shelter on most of my trips this summer, and I've spent many nights in all kinds of weather in it, so I'm ready to give you my early impressions. And full disclosure, I bought this tent with my own money, and I have no financial connection with Durston Gear. First, the basics. I'll put the measurements, schematics from the Durston Gear website on the screen right now, while I tell you that the X-Mid 2 weighs in at 36 ounces, not counting the stakes. It comes with 8 stakes, 4 titanium shepherd hooks, and 4 titanium V-stakes, and it has number 5 AquaGuard waterproof zippers on the fly with number 3 zippers for the inner. It's made from silk poly instead of the more commonly used silk nylon. Now, the merits and shortcomings of those two fabrics are a topic of hot debate on the forums, with few actual facts to back up the more wild claims. It seems safe to say that silk nylon is stronger, although whether it's a tiny bit or twice as strong depends on who's telling the tale. Advantages of silk poly are greater UV resistance and less stretch, so no need to tighten guy lines a second time after the initial pitch. Now, I'm probably not the guy to resolve these issues because I've always thought the whole stretches after pitching problem is exaggerated, and I think the strength and durability differences might matter to a through hiker, but aren't really going to matter much to the average hiker like me. I can tell you that the silk poly in the X-Mid is less air permeable than silk nylon, which is obvious when trying to roll it up. Air that gets trapped in the tent is much harder to squeeze out with the silk poly. Don't know if that means anything in the real world. It doesn't translate to being more waterproof as you might think, because both materials have about the same rating, which is 2,500 to 3,000 hydrostatic head. Perhaps one of the most telling facts I can share with you is that as of 2022, Tarp Tent has switched to making the Stratospire 2 out of silk poly. Pitching the X-Mid is dirt simple, just 4 stakes to make a rectangle, making sure to form a right angle with the third stake, then inserting the poles either through the vents or my preferred method through the doors, then raise the poles until top. I don't have a specific length that I use for the poles. I just start from where they are at already from hiking, which for me is usually around 115 centimeters, and go from there. I found this way easier than extending the poles in advance to a certain length before inserting them. There's a lot of bragging about how this shelter only needs 4 stakes to set up, but I think that's a bit misleading because you're going to want to also stake out the vestibules, which requires 2 more stakes. Still, just 6 stakes for a very stable ultralight shelter is awesome. One aspect I haven't seen other reviewers comment on is that because of the steepness of the walls, when raising the poles, there seems to be a great deal of upward pressure on the stakes. My first time pitching the X-Mid in the wild was in sandy soil next to a river, and the stakes just pulled right out. I had to put rocks on each stake to hold them in, and I still ended up with a pretty pitiful pitch. Although the stakes that come with the X-Mid are nice, I replaced them with my usual kit, which is 4 8-inch Easton nails for the corners and 4 MSR needle stakes for the rest. You would need the last 2 stakes to put out the extra peak guy lines, which is recommended in high winds. There are 2 overhead pockets at both peaks and pockets down low next to the doors. One thing that has changed with the second version is these pockets are less deep, which is a good change to make in my opinion. I don't really use these much when I'm sleeping solo. I keep everything I need during the night on the ground beside me, but they would definitely play a big role with 2 people in the shelter. Condensation is well managed with the vents and double walls. I was concerned about how close the mesh is to the outer wall, even nearly touching in some places like on the low sloping side, and maybe that's my fault for not having the pitch just right. But the mesh is so fine that water runs off it right to the ground instead of coming through. And of course, there are 2 large vents to also help mitigate condensation. They have little struts to hold the vent open, and they can be stowed if you're expecting bad weather. There's also Velcro closure here to keep that secure in high winds. And the struts are small enough so they don't create a problem when rolling up the tent either. The X-Mid 2 has double doors and vestibules, and the doors are large enough and high enough so there's no problem with getting in and out easily. When setting up, the fly is pitched first, which is a very handy feature if you do have to set it up in the rain. Then you can crawl inside to attach the inner tent without getting rain inside it. The inner clips to the 2 peaks, and the buckle is easy to manage. The corners of the inner tent are attached to the fly with fixed length string and mitten hooks, which keeps it nicely taut. Notice that I have clipped the tongues of the mitten hooks, which makes them easier to attach and detach. So things I really like about the X-Mid 2, number 1 is space. Of course, it's a palace for one personally, very comfy, and I really enjoyed not having my head and feet jammed against the netting as they are in my Kufu. In fact, I decided to take the X-Mid 2 on my long trip of the year in the Wind River Range just because I wanted to be more comfortable, even though, I probably should have been shaving weight for the longer trip. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to test this shelter with 2 actual bodies in it, which is probably the first question anyone would have about it. If you saw the video of the trip I took with my great-nephew Dax, you know that I planned to use the X-Mid then, but at the very last minute we decided to crash a rental cabin instead, which is pretty funny considering that hiking with Dax was my justification for buying a 2-person shelter in the first place. I guess maybe I don't need justification for buying new gear. What I can tell you is that there is plenty of space for 2 wide pads, so I believe it would be fine for 2 fairly friendly people. Also, my occasional hiking buddies, Chris and Alex, got the X-Mid 2 Pro, and they say it fits them just fine. They're able to sleep shoulder to shoulder, but it seems to me that the X-Mid is really designed to sleep 2 people head to foot better. Now that might get me in a fight with the actual designer, Dan Durston, who has denied that it was designed this way and stated that most folks sleep side by side just fine. But look, wouldn't you want the low pocket to be by your head? There's one there and the other is offset over here. Also, I would want the steep side by my head too, with the low sloping side over the legs, and that's offset as well. Third, the doors are opposite, which means that one of you would be using the door the wrong way, if there is such a thing as a wrong way. Anyway, suit yourself, whatever works is fine. I just wanted to tease Dan about that one point. Now the second thing I really like is the quick, easy setup. Probably just as fast as my mid, and even though the sleeping space is offset from the fly, it seemed easier to line up with the spot I wanted to lay in than with the StratusSpire 2. Also, I like the stability of 2 poles versus 1 with the mid. I used this shelter in several rainy nights, but only one more serious windstorm, and in that case the wind was probably 35 to 40 miles per hour for about 20 minutes, and the X-Mid held up no problem.
Well, the X-Mid did pretty well. Certainly stayed dry inside. There were a few times with the gusty wind that I thought maybe I should have had the tie-outs done. That's these guys here, which I haven't used yet, obviously. But it weathered that amount of gusty wind just fine.
I really appreciate the clever placement of the poles, which means that they're never in the way getting in and out of the shelter. And I love that Dan even thought to put a little strap here to go over the handle of your trekking pole to secure the sides and so that the zipper can be used with one hand. Although I think a little pocket might work better there because the strap does slide a bit up on the pole. I found the vestibules to be surprisingly useful. I'm not sure why that is exactly, except there's something about this little part here that works well for various gear. I especially like being able to lean my empty pack against the trekking pole for the night instead of leaning against the mesh sidewall, which never felt quite right to me. This setup also seemed to provide better views outside the tent with the larger wing secured than with my Kufu. What about the cons? Well, the number 3 zipper on the inner is certainly delicate. I've had that get a little sticky at times going around the corner when I wasn't being careful enough using it, so you'll want to pay attention to that. Second, the stuff sack is just too small. I wish that they would just add a couple of inches to the length to make it easier to pack the tent inside. I did figure out that it worked better to roll the tent longer than the actual stuff sack and then fold that extra in, and that usually worked pretty good for me. A third point is that the lines are a bit too short and tough to pull tight. This cord is kind of knobby, so it doesn't slide very well through the line lock. Someday when I have extra time, I would like to just replace those with maybe a 10-inch piece of cordage from Lawson Equipment, and I think that would probably work better. Some folks have complained about it having a large footprint, and I certainly have struggled at times fitting it into some tight spots. On the other hand, it is a genuine 2-person shelter and not really larger in footprint than similar sized shelters. In fact, for me it was easier to find space for the X-Mid than the StratusSpire. I already mentioned switching out the stakes because they were too short for me, although I should say that I've seen lots of other reviews that were just fine with the stakes, so maybe that's more of a personal preference thing and not really a con. So the door tie-out is a bit fiddly, although pretty much the same as most ultralight shelters use, so I can't complain too much about that. I just wanted to mention it though because another change that is in the second version is these are now magnetic closures, which I haven't seen in person, but I imagine would be a great improvement. I hope that they also shifted the tie-out down a few inches because it seems like it should have been lower so that it would be more in the middle of this bunch of material. Lots of folks have asked for a comparison between the Tarp Tent StratusSpire 2 and the X-Mid 2, which is a whole nother video that I do plan to make, but the short version is this. The X-Mid 2 is 8 ounces lighter, 6 inches longer, and $60 cheaper. But the biggest advantage for me personally is not having to do with the struts on the Tarp Tent, which make packing the shelter in the pack more difficult. The X-Mid fits horizontally in the pack no problem, although it is a bit bulky, so that can be a challenge if you're headed out for a longer trip with a smaller pack, as I was with the Kakwa 40 for 5 days on the Wind River trip. In that case, I just strapped the X-Mid on top for the first few days until I had eaten enough food for it to be able to fit inside. The X-Mid 2 has high quality construction. The sewing is spot on with bar tacks on all the stress points. The seams are taped and the floor is not as slippery as it is with sil nylon. But by far the best thing to say about the X-Mid 2 is the price. It could have had all kinds of things wrong with it and still be worth a recommendation just for the price, which is currently just $300 US. I don't know Dan really well. We met just once, but I think it is worth mentioning that this shelter is in huge demand, and he could easily have jacked up the price significantly, but he seems to be carving a moral high ground and keeping the profit margins low, I guess to allow more folks to experience the joys of backpacking. If I'm reading that rightly, I have to say, good for you, Dan. Bottom line, in my opinion, the X-Mid 2 is not just the best 2-person ultralight tent on the market under $1 gazillion, it's also the cheapest. I like the design so much I've been eyeing the 1-person because even though it's a little heavier than my current DCF Kufu, I'm wondering if it wouldn't be more livable inside the mesh inner tent. So if Durston Gear feels like sending me one to test, I'd be willing to do that. Or even the Pro version. I would do that for Dan. Okay guys, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Thanks big time for subscribing, and I'll see you next time. Take care.